co-founder of the African Fashion Research Institute. I have lectured and I am a decolonial fashion writer, speaker, provocateur, if you could call it that. But I'm really interested in how we can get these conversations to come together. So we have two fantastic guests joining us today. We have Simone Cipriani, who is joining us from another continent. But I'm going to join first. I think I'm going to start with Omoyemi before we get to move from the continent and just spreading ourselves a little bit across the continent. And if Omoyemi is available to join us, just maybe a short introduction, Omoyemi, and then perhaps, you know, just starting off this question of all you need to know about African fashion is such a huge and challenging and cheeky provocation to start, but maybe just from your work, working with designers, working with fashion on the continent, just identifying some of the emerging trends that you're starting to see coming up over the last, you know, few years. What are these emerging trends in terms of fashion from this continent? So thank you. Over to you, Omoyemi. Thank you.
Sorry, hi everyone. I'm just trying to switch networks. Please accept my apology. Just give me 2 minutes to sort that out, and then, so maybe we can start with Simone while I get this sorted in 2 minutes. I hope you don't mind.
Absolutely. No, again, we will come back to the continent. Maybe that's what we first need to do. We need to leave the continent and then come back to it. So Simone, absolutely the same. You know, you've done incredible work working closely with creatives on the continent. Just, you know, in the last few years, you know, from your position in working with designers and the industry, what are your emerging trends that you're seeing coming through? Thank you, Simone.
Hi, thank you, Erica. Hello, everybody. Hello, Omoyemi, my old friend of Miami. We've not been seeing each other for 75 years, so it's nice to see her today here. Well, I'm speaking from Geneva, where our head office is, although I spend the majority of my time traveling a lot in the continent, in Western Africa and in Eastern Africa, and a bit in Central Asia. I used to stay quite a bit also in Afghanistan before things changed last summer. And then the places where we work, where we have the market, where we have our trade partners, the fashion brands in Europe, in the US, in Japan. I just finished a round of travels in the US and in Italy to meet and in Paris to meet several of our trade partners. I see some trends emerging, and I'd like to speak about what I see in relation to the continent, to our work in Africa, and to what could be the perspective for our work, at least in the continent. So first of all, I see a global, you know, we are both suppliers. We manage a supply chain that involves many artisans in different countries, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, and so on. And we also are an accelerator, a business accelerator for emerging brands, for young African brands. So I see from the point of view of the supply chain, what I see is a restructuring of the global supply chain. The global supply chain has been disrupted by COVID, we all know it, all the issues about transport, supply, and so on. But this also created the ground for the emergence of some regional supply chains, stronger regional supply chains. Some elements of the global one will always remain, at least for now, but some regional supply chains, stronger regional supply chains are emerging. And the one I see more closely is the supply chain connected to Europe, which tries to solidify its links with the Mediterranean, with the North African part of the Mediterranean, with Turkey and so on, but also with Sub-Saharan Africa. This may be an opportunity for the industry as suppliers in the supply chain. And I see a second trend which is favorable to this, and it's, you all know it better than me, it's the trend on sustainability, which is something very, very strong. You know that we have created an ESG due diligence system, which is being tested by the Italian fashion industry, by the Association of all Italian fashion brands, and it's ESG due diligence and then performance monitoring and sustainability reporting. So we are quite close to the reasoning in terms of sustainability, and I see brands that more and more look at distributors for sustainable productions and for kinds of sustainability, which is quite close to capacities and skills that I find in several of the places where we work. One of them is circularity. In Eastern Africa, we work quite a lot by recycling second-hand garments. In Swahili there, we call them mitumba. Mitumba has been a big problem in that area because in the old days, it has displaced local productions, killing a lot of local productions, displacing them in the market. But now, mitumba is becoming more and more a raw material for new productions to take place around mitumba. So also a tool, a vehicle to create more jobs. And in some of the places where we work, we see a lot of experience in recycling, in reusing, in this kind of mentality. One of the line managers of our production lines in Kenya always tells me, hey, Simone, we do not waste anything here. We reuse everything. And it's true. There's a skill, there's a culture for it, and there's a need, so much so that in our supply chain, we are discussing with some investors to set up a fully circular factory based on the availability of mitumba. But there are many more examples. Another one is cotton in Western Africa. In one of the places where we work, which is Burkina Faso, where we have quite a large supply chain for fabric, we have the investment of a large Italian fashion brand, a very big one, that is investing to expand our capacities in using natural dyes and in transforming organic cotton, because they discovered that we use renewables when it comes to the few machines that we have, that we use bio-cotton, so we have no biogeochemicals. So we have very small emissions that in practice decarbonize the supply chain of our client, not only ours. So this is also another element, this element of sustainability. We don't know what shape it will take in the industry. We see now the industry moving towards easy shots, new materials, a lot of materials, renewables at headquarters, and all this kind of stuff. But something deeper has to come also, because this industry has to get to net zero by 2050, which means that it has to decarbonize and change the business model heavily before 2030. So this is quite a task, and this will require much more than what happens today. And there may be a place for producers in the continent in this if they seize the trend of sustainability. And then the third point is for designers in general, for creatives, because I see this emerging, but this Omoyemi knows these things much better than me, this emerging market for fashion made in Africa. I remember the days in which a huge market for a brand like Valentino, I'm old, so I remember this quite a while ago, for Valentino was in Nigeria, was in Lagos, but now the place for many of the places that I visit, I'm sure Omoyemi knows much more than me about Lagos and neighboring countries. I know something in Ivory Coast, in Ghana, and so on. And I see a lot of space for African fashion in the top, a growing market for fashion, for real fashion. And at the same time, I also see a desire with the European brands, at least, of design collaborations co-branding, but more than co-branding, design collaborations with emerging designers. Just to give you an example, a brand that we interact a lot with, which is Gucci, they have a program which is called Vault, V-A-U-L-T, Vault, which is about promoting collaborations in between the creative director of the brand and emerging designers. Let's see also what happened to Lucanium Dinghi, who won the LVMH award. And we did an event in Paris at Le Claret, which is a great showroom in the fashion industry with some African designers, and it was a roaring success. So I also, for brands who came to see these designers, to see their capacities and to ask, hey, we could have a form of collaboration. So these are all things that I see happening that could be of interest. I'm sure Omoyemi and my fellow panelists have much more to say around that.
Thank you so much, Cipriani, Simone. There's just so much that you've shared with us there, but I'm going to hand it straight over to Omoyemi. I think the two of you are speaking to such lived experiences. So Omoyemi, please, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to start by apologizing for my little glitch, or, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm super inspired by by what you're doing, by the Africa Talks, and the fact that, the setting is, in, I don't know, Karoo. I have not been, but I can just visualize it, and I'm just like, wow, I'm sure the view must be incredible, and just being able to experience all that in real life. So thank you so much for inviting me. I think I struggle a little bit with this because most of the work we do has been centered or focused around the idea of ensuring that when it comes to Africa fashion or anything concerning Africa fashion, that we don't see it as a trend, because that word trend in itself suggests or implies that, it's here today and gone tomorrow. And for me, when fashion speaks to the very essence, and when fashion contributes to the very essence of lives of people, it cannot be a trend. When you think about fashion and you look at it within the context of, like, Simone, the great Simone has, told us, the vision has so eloquently, phrased it over and over again, that, when you think about the idea of communities coming together from different parts of the continent, working together to create, fashion, to create, to working on their craftsmanship and bringing collections out season after season, and whether or not it's sold within the continent or beyond, that tells a little bit more. It shows that this goes to the very essence of who we are. It's a part of us. So no matter what happens, no matter what, it's what we're always going to do. And so when we look at, back to the question, like what's happening on the continent today, I think the last 2 years has been very instrumental in, in sort of steering us or galvanizing us to where we're at today. COVID-19 pandemic, if there's nothing we've learned from it, is for it to further let us let us understand that we need each other. Most of the time, fashion is viewed through a one-dimensional lens. People always see the end product, and you don't necessarily see what's happening behind the scenes. So if we're going to look at the example of Mitumba or Bendown Select, or, all over across the continent, we know the secondhand good, we know it's a problem. We know that, this is something that's always existed, and, fashion, the textile and apparel industry is trying to grow around it, So when we look at that, for example, it's important for us to come together, to co-create, to collaborate, and come up with ideas on how we can further strengthen the ecosystem, and how to ensure that bottlenecks might exist across the value chain, but how do we solve it? How do we, in Nigeria in particular, where I live, where I'm at now, as a matter of fact, I'm just coming from the factory where We've just, you know, we had to bring someone in to sort of implement like a different assembly line to help the people that we've trained to improve their efficiency in production, you know? So when you bring it back home a little, and then the trainer, because sometimes it's even so difficult to find people who can work with you to increase capacity. So the person who's doing this is someone else who owns another factory, who's been kind enough and generous enough to spare some time to come in, you know? So for me, when I read outside, you know, see news clippings and there's a reference to it as trend, I don't see that as trend. I see it as a group of people. I see it as community being the starting point of our creative process, you know. It's a community of people coming together to co-create solutions on how to ensure that, you know, at every point within the value chain, or at every point within our ecosystem, which I prefer, because sometimes I find it hard to see the semblance of an industry, at least where I'm from, you know. So how do we co-create solutions to ensure that everyone who's worked, you know, benefits substantially? How do we contribute in such a way, you know, like Simone is saying that, you know, in different parts of the world, conversations are happening about ESG, you know, you're thinking about the environment, you're thinking about social structures, governance, and all of that. How do we ensure that, you know, in our, you know, in designers, no matter how young they are, no matter where they're at, you know, they have an understanding of the role they play within the value chain. They understand the role their community plays, you know. So yes, fashion to me fashion saves lives, you know. Fashion saves lives because it creates jobs. Fashion creates jobs, and in the same sense, you know, it helps to keep craftsmanship alive. It helps to keep our heritage, you know, of craftsmanship alive in villages and communities spread across the continent, you know. And so it's very important, you know, that we start having conversations, like I think what Simone also mentioned, like how do we create structure for this to thrive? I think that's where the conversation is now, beyond the trend, beyond how we're perceived in the world. We know who we are. I don't think we're disillusioned. We know who we are. We know where we've come from, you know. So, but how do we build on it? How do we build on it to create impact around, you know, like, you know, 7 pillars that we focused on? You know, when we look at sustainability, we look at knowledge, we look at existing infrastructure, we look within the confinement of retail. You know, how do we ensure that, you know, we're strengthening what we have within our ecosystem? How do we add value? How do we create businesses that, you know, are sustainable from that end, businesses that can, you know, outlive us? How do we ensure that, you know, at the end of the day, we're not back in this room 10 years from now exploring why Africa is a trend, you know, why Africa fashion is a trend, as opposed to Africa fashion is fashion. Africa fashion, you know, is accessible across the continent. Africa fashion is, you know, we know who we are, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the first thing we use in trying to identify, you know, we know what our identity is, you know. So yes, and this goes back to a lot of factors like storytelling, you know, what you know, for the last 10, 15 years, there's been conversations around changing the narratives, but we need to change the narrative, but we have to be able to move beyond that, you know, to come in together, to work together. You know, that's why conversations like this are important. You know, I might be in Lagos, Nigeria, Erica, you're in, you know, South Africa, Jackie, you know, and that's the beauty as what do I want to say, as deadly as the pandemic was, you know, but it's also brought us to this moment. In the real world, I would have probably flown into South Africa, Simone would have flown in from Geneva, you know, everyone would have had to congregate in a physical place. But here we are, you know, in this room. I don't see this as a conversation. I see this as an opportunity for us to co-create solutions to strengthen the ecosystem in a collaborative way, where we bring in, you know, the textile designers, we bring in, you know, the technology experts, we bring in people who can, you know, bring in the funding, all that we need to create a stronger ecosystem for Africa fashion as we know it today to be able to survive. And I think for me, you know, that's what's most important at this stage.
Thank you so much, Omoyemi, and absolutely, I completely agree with you that I think what has happened in the past, historically, that Africa has been a trend. It happened in the 1920s, it happened in the 1960s, it happened in the 1980s, that there was a foray of interest in things African, and then they would fade. And so I would say that maybe what we're witnessing now is an emerging transformation of the perception, understanding, and listening to the narratives, to the projects, to the collaborations that are coming out of from across the continent. And I think that change in the visibility of designers from the continent, the change in the capacity for us to have voices and to be heard from the continent, I think is making a fundamental change in the way that African fashion is understood, but also in the kinds of relations that Simone, that you're proposing, that these are co-brandings, these are collaborations, these are circular relations and ongoing relations. And I think this is a major shift that I would say over the last decade, and maybe Simone, you could maybe speak to, you know, having been involved in work with projects on the continent, how has this evolved, and moving forward, what would be your wish for these relations and these cyclical, sustainable, collaborative possibilities? You know, what would be on that program for you? Simone, are you joining us?
Yes, sorry, I thought you were asking to Stephen. Are you there?
Yes.
I do not hear you well. Can you repeat the last part of the question?
I was just asking, just in terms of the projects that you have been involved in, what has changed over the years, but really moving forward, what would be the wish for the kinds of collaborative, sustainable, circular projects that have really stood out for you in working in the fashion industry?
Yes. I didn't grasp the whole thing, and I heard also another name, so I was not sure that the question was for me. But do you hear me well now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, over the last years, first of all, what I said before, this issue of sustainability and of circularity, circular collaborations on decarbonization of the supply chain, going straight to the origin of some materials such as cotton and so on, the use of biomaterials. This is something that has incredibly strengthened our position in the market as suppliers, so much so that our sales in these things have increased. And after, I don't say the end of the pandemic, because this terrible virus is still around, but since summer last year, we have seen a huge increase in orders and in collaborations around these themes, and also in collaboration with designers in request of co-branding or co-design, not co-branding, with African designers from European fashion brands, an increased interest in this kind of collaborations. Then I also see things, interesting things. I see things happening that remind me about the place where I was born and how things were in fashion there. I was born in central Italy, in Tuscany, not far from a place called Prato, which was a place where there was a huge textile industry based exclusively on recycling second-hand clothes from the US. this huge textile cluster was developed in the 50s after the Second World War out of recycling of second-hand clothes from the US. They arrived in bales, in huge bales. So these bales were sorted out in order to separate all the different materials, and this cluster specialized in working on wool. It became very well known, and it became a fashion center just doing that. Then over the years, then the things evolved, and then production with new wool came in. But at the very beginning, it established itself as a fashion production center for raw material, for fabric out of this. I see a lot of bales of second-hand clothes and textiles that come to the continent. Some of these bales are usually unsorted out, undefined, so you have everything inside them. So that's a problem. There should be a work with those who send the bales of sorting them at the origin in order to separate the different materials. I don't say the colors, but at least the different materials. But then there are capacities, there is a technology, there is know-how on how to then use these also in recycling them into new fabric. Of course, these are water-intensive processes, so this means also an attention to the usage of natural capital, of fresh water, and this means the treatment of effluents and then recycling, complete recycling of water, because these are wet processes. But today you have all this technology. I come from tanning, where we have implemented effluent treatment plants already decades ago, and in the textile industry, they are very good at that. In the same textile cluster of Prato I mentioned before, they now recycle water completely. So I see strange connections in between know-how, technology, know-how of the past, the technology of today, the need of circularity and the need of sustainability. And I see this happening in some of the places where I work in the continent. I always say the continent because you are Africans, but you teach me that it's a huge amount of countries. When you say Africa, you don't mean much. One thing I agree, what Omoyemi said, it's not, and what you repeated, it's not a trend, African fashion. It's a reality, and it's a market, it's a reality of production, it's a community, or better, several different communities that dialogue and that try to change, as Omoyemi said in a beautiful way, they change the narrative. But it is what I see and what I have seen changing. And then I've also seen a new attitude towards product development coming, because people, one problem in the places where I work, at least, is that there are some general diseconomies linked to customs or to transport, bank payments and so on, and then a different way of doing things with different kind of human resources and so on. Omoyemi is mentioning this, the director of production and this and that. So this means that when you come to product development, which is the key moment of collaboration, international collaboration, product development is difficult because people ask you to develop products very quickly. Very quickly, I give you a week, I'll give you 2 weeks, and where we are, this is difficult for all these factors. But I see now brands and distributors that are embarking on a different kind of product development because they have long-term projects. And I see more of them. I see more projects without a season, but more projects not linked to a single season, but to a long-term project of development of products and so on. And I see this consistent with the capacities we have at hand in the continent. But I see a huge development. I would like to have this conversation in 5 years' time, because I mean, we will be astonished to hear this today, and in 5 years we may say, hey, we were in prehistory, look where we are today.
Thank you so much. Absolutely, I would also love to. And as I'm saying, you know, there really is a much greater shift in terms of how the the absolute sort of multiplicity of projects, of crafts, of textiles, of histories, of makers. There's an explosion of acknowledging these voices. When I'm just looking,
an explosion. This is the right word of acknowledging this, absolutely, and also the need to protect cultural identities, which is now something which is discussed widely and in more serious terms than in the past. I completely agree with what you said before.
Thank you, and maybe that was also where I was just maybe thinking to ask Omoyemi, and this idea that a greater kind of respect for the practices, for the histories, and for the heritages coming through in the work of designers is not so much just a once-off effort at kind of recuperation, but it's a real commitment. There's a real commitment to telling the stories, a real commitment to the histories, a real commitment to the communities of origin, and that these stories are growing again. There's a kind of generative and communal growth around these fashion identities, these fashion journeys, these fashion trajectories into the future. So maybe if you want to either share some of the designers who are working in this way, that are really bringing heritage, history, culture, and the contemporary together in envisaging futures, ethical, sustainable futures.
Thank you so much. I think there are quite a few, so to buttress what you're saying, yes, that connection between our traditional African heritage and that reinterpretation into contemporary fashion in defining, what's coming out of the continent today, that's already been established. And it's this ongoing intersectionality between contemporary fashion and historic cultural reference points that have shaped, that's currently shaping what's happening on the scene today. Yes, I think for us at Lagos Fashion Week, and at Style House Files, we've celebrated this heritage of craftsmanship that's often expressed creatively by designers from across the continent, whether you have Ghanaian designers like Christy Brown, who's committed to working with silhouettes that's inspired by her grandmother's wrapper or the way she ties her wrapper. Or we look at Makosa from South Africa, whose work is a reflection of I don't know how to pronounce it, of the Tosa tribe, or you come to Eastern Africa, take Kenya, for example, you have designers who ask, if you look at the book that Sonny wrote about Am I African Enough, their work is not even, they don't necessarily focus on that, but does that make them less African, So you look into Nigeria and the designers like maybe Diola Sego, whose work's, been a reflection of, she's been able to modernize the use of Ashoke, or you look at, Emi Casbet, whose work on Akwete has also, he's done quite a bit with that. So there are people, there are designers across the continent who've ensured that, I'm not quite sure I want to use the word deliberate, but they're committed. It was a desire to be influenced by craftsmanship or by what they've seen, and how they've reinterpreted it over the years is something that's been truly inspiring. Or if we think about Adele Dejac, for example, who makes jewelry. So let's not even look at fashion in that sense, and who's committed to sourcing locally. Or, we look at a designer who launched recently, whose work is based completely on secondhand clothes, and then he exports it back, outside the continent. So there are different people, there are different stories that's coming up, and is really inspiring. But but beyond handcrafted jewelry made in Kenya, inspired by various African tribes, I think the question the elephant in the room has always been beyond creativity. So beyond creativity, what's next? And that's what we've in the last 5-6 years we've tried to focus the most of the work that we do. Like beyond creativity, we believe that fashion from the continent has enormous potential to drive that much needed change that we need to see between the people, between the process of making and the resources that contribute significantly to all the garments that we see on our runway, from Lagos to Johannesburg, Cape Town, to Uganda, just different parts of the continent, So beyond creativity, how can we ensure that, I keep saying this over and over again, how can we create that careful balance to ensure that, what makes the essence of Africa fashion, what makes it truly unique, what makes it truly special, how do we preserve it? And in that preservation, how do we preserve its fragility? How do we build communities, foster collaborations that can gradually help us to build or define the sustainable future that we hope to see? I believe that the kind of innovation that we need for this industry, it has to be homegrown. It has to be collaborative efforts between stakeholders at solving some of these bottlenecks. I don't like calling them problems or challenges, because, when you think about it as a problem, then it becomes a problem, So how do we work around it, Yeah, so the designers' creativity exists. There's talent on the continent, that is something we can all take to the bank, but how do we preserve it? Those are the kind of conversations that I'm hoping, not just me, I don't have all the answers, but maybe there are people in the room who have answers to how, to ensure that, because when we think about the question of scaling fashion from the continent, for example, how do you scale something that's been done by hand, Do you scale in commercial quantities? That's a challenge we have, and that's the message we're trying to pass out there is African fashion is timeless. It's not necessarily bound to the confinements and restrictions of seasons, autumn, winter, spring, summer, because the process of making for us, it takes a while. That's why it's called slow fashion for a reason. And I'm not making excuses for why it sometimes takes us a while to meet the demands of delivering certain numbers between a particular frame of time for retailers across the world. But it's just for people to understand that, it takes time. It takes time for weaving to happen, for embellishments to take place. It takes time for construction, and that's what makes Africa fashion truly different and beautiful. And when we look at sourcing fabrics alone, where you're sat today at the Karu Wool,
Wool Festival.
Yes, the Karu Wool Festival, imagine natural fibers, those kind of things are not rushed, So the conversations that's important that I want us to also start to have is, how do you scale up something like that? Is it
Absolutely. I think Omoyemi will join us back again. Just on that, yeah.
Sorry, are there other ways that you can capitalize on creativity without the race to the bottom approach, So so that I don't keep asking questions, I think it's important that we take a view that looks at fashion on the continent beyond creativity, because it does exist. It's in the community next door. It's, it's with the community of hand dyeing, women who hand dye just not too far from here. And I'm sure not too far from you, the women who hand embellish, who are, and yeah.
Absolutely. And maybe that's exactly what we're kind of coming to, is that we're no longer looking for the answers. We are the problem solvers. We do carry the answers. We do listen to each other. So it's really about listening to each other and supporting each other and supporting the development of this industry. And I think there were a number of questions in the chat. We might have a chance to come to that, but maybe just to think about what these supportive mechanisms are to ensure the kinds of growth or the kinds of development of of these ecosystems, and therefore the larger kind of industry. And Simone, I think you're kind of pointing to some of that already, with the growth and demand for a different kind of fashion, in the world, a different kind. And we on this continent have been developing a different kind of fashion ecosystem. And so how do we ensure support for that?
Sorry, I was muted, sorry. You see my age from this kind of mistakes. Yeah, it's quite a question, quite a difficult one, because the trends are there, all the things that Omoyemi said. I won't use the word trend, not to upset my friend Omoyemi. Let's say the change is there, and this global movement inside the continent Omoyemi is referring to is there. How to facilitate this? It's quite a task. I think one element is, Omoyemi touched a bit this point, connecting all the communities in the continent that work on this, and enabling the communities to have a dialogue, to have an exchange of experiences and of good practices. And platforms like Lagos Fashion Week can be very, very useful for this, because these are meeting points, and there are other examples. The other point is to, and now I'll come to business. Another good point is the cost of capital. Let's be sincere, capital is too expensive. Capital is too expensive, and the required return for an investment are usually too high. And an emerging brand, a young brand, a small fashion brand, is not able to have this kind, to produce this kind of returns for an investor. So we need more availability of capital. We need credit institutions, even capital, not only for investment, for investors, but also for working capital. If you want to finance pre-shipping finance in practically working capital for production in Burkina Faso, you have to pay something in between 15 and 16% of interest rate on an annual basis. In Europe, this would be considered impossible, literally impossible. But in Burkina, they ask you this amount of money. And I know places where I work where the interest rate can also be higher. And then there's a lot of guarantees, a lot of collaterals, and this and that. So I think, but do you still hear me? Hello?
Yes, I do still hear you. We do still hear you.
Okay, so the first point is the availability of capital, and also to have a new role for angel investors in emerging brands. Angel investors all over the world have been moving from angels to venture capital investors. It's difficult to find real angel investors, in the sense of people that put capital into something without expecting a huge return immediately. But this is something that we need to discuss, because capital is available in the continent, is available with other sectors, telecommunication and raw materials and so on. And maybe in the CSR budgets of all these giants, there can be a place for angel investment and for the ways to support seed investment facilities, because this is what we are talking about: seed investment, angel investment, pre-investment capital, concessional capital, capital at acceptable rates, which is not the market, the local market rate, because it is too high. I think this is a point we need all to join forces together, all the communities that work in the continent, and to work on this together. This is extremely important. And then the point of some common infrastructure in terms of production, some big product development centers where you can also train people and from other countries, where you can train the human resources that you need in production, direction of production, quality control, the maintenance of machinery and so on. And also maybe also a proper fashion school with a very technical curriculum, with very technical CV, which is not only about design and things, but also about how things are made, in order to develop these capacities. And then last but not least, the custom thing, and the custom and transport. If I ship the fabric I produce in Burkina Faso to Kenya to be transformed into bags, sometimes it's cheaper to send it to Paris and then from Paris to send it to Kenya. And this is a reality. And this is a reality. Even within a single custom union, things are not so straightforward. I used to send cotton from in between Mali and Burkina Faso. At moments, Mali needed cotton from Burkina Faso and so on. But I mean, the custom procedures are unbelievable. You waste days. And it's within the same custom union. I mean, not the situation of now. There was an embargo until recently, but that's another story. But even before. So these things, maybe all our communities can join forces and can address these points. Maybe Omoyemi can organize a big meeting on these things in Lagos Fashion Week, and I'll come to say, yes, it's true, and moving also, and speaking also with donors. I mean, a lot of donors, also institutional donors, invest in the continent in different ways, European Union, European states, the US, and so on, UK. But let's tell them, guys, focus your investment along some lines that the development of human resources, capacity, infrastructure, and the thing of capital, capital, ciao.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're so right, Simone, when you talk about that, because we have to, distribution is real, we cannot be talking about creativity and talent and all of this beauty, and we're having, I mean, the African continent is home to about 1.2 billion people. And, we cannot, we keep having conversations around intra-African trade, a whole, the ratification of trade agreements been set up to ensure that there's movement of goods, but you're still struggling because, there's a complex web of visas. There's just so much. And then when you talk about education, we have to think about, you've talked about decolonization, I think, Erica, so there's so much going on. And, these are the conversations that we need to have so that we can begin to have some semblance of, to be able to measure impacts, so with distribution, education, capital, funding, and I don't know, sorry, sometimes when you think about this, it can be a bit draining and you want to be like, oh gosh, do we continue or do we go on? But we must forge on. And I guess that's why we're all here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That is absolutely why we are all here. I would love to kind of open up to questions, but I know that this is only the beginning of the conversation. And Jackie was quite, clear that we needed to be close to the hour. So I think we're kind of wrapping up, and perhaps just to really recognize where we're speaking from. We're speaking from a place that has been disrupted. The world does need new solutions. And I guess a really important, Jackie would like to say something, but I think a really important opening that you mentioned, Simone, fashion can save lives, and the role of fashion in revisiting and revisioning some of those conversations. So Jackie, maybe just to wrap up, I know your camera is not working, but maybe you just want to wrap up.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. It was a really, really great conversation. And there's some fantastic comments in the comment section, which I hope you've had a chance to read. But, and Omoyemi, so fantastic to make the contact with you, so that it's just wonderful to have the conversation with Lagos and Cape Town and the Karoo and Joburg and Cape Town, etc. But thank you for your time, and thank you everybody in the room for joining us. And Erica, thank you so much for moderating, and I hope that everybody else enjoyed it. I'm sure you all did as much as I did, and that you registered to listen to the other talks that we're hosting today and tomorrow. And thank you, Simone, and thank you, Omoyemi, again. Really wonderful.
Goodbye, everybody. Take care.
Yeah,
Thank you.
wonderful.
Bye.
Thank
Bye. Bye.